All right, good morning, everyone. So today we're going to be talking about front-end authentication. We talked a lot about back-end authentication yesterday, so it's important that you understand everything from the back end. So before we get started today, was there any questions or clarifications that need to be made about what we talked about yesterday? Is everybody clear about how tokens work, what you need to do to get a token, how you would use a token, everything? Yeah.
Oh yeah, I understand the concept of a token. I don't know if this was already mentioned, but how do you log out a user after the token is finished?
Okay, so essentially, how do you log out a user once the token is finished? That's a tricky one. So you can make the token invalid, and so some token libraries, or you can add this to our token library, allow you to add an expiration date to the token. And so the token will just expire after some date, and then you'll have to get a new one. And so in order to log out, you kind of just let that go. Have a very short expiration date, and then it'll expire. They'll have to re-log in or get a new token just by visiting the site. But there's no real good way to make a token gone. I guess the way we implemented it, we could have logout being just deleting the token that's included with the users in their database. So if you don't have a token associated with you when you try to log in, it will not match what we have on record, and so you'll be effectively logged out. But there's no real official way to do it. Yeah?
And also, I'm sure you mentioned this yesterday, but could you reiterate what are the advantages of cookies? Because it seems like a lot of websites tend to use cookies over tokens.
Yeah, we'll talk about that today, actually.
Oh, okay.
Any other questions or clarifications from yesterday? We went pretty fast, so none? All right, so today we'll move it to the front end. So a lot of the same concepts, but just from a different perspective. So first, using JOTs. So does everybody remember what a JOT is? The JSON Web Token? And so we need to send that token with every single request that we make on the front end because the back end now expects it for every request. And we need to save it somewhere. And so where do we save it on our front end? We have a couple choices. One as a cookie. So browsers allow you to save things as cookies, and they're automatically sent with requests. Or within Html5 storage. So that's either local storage or session storage. And so what is a cookie? So a cookie is just a small amount of information stored within your browser by a site that you visit. They're only limited to about 4 kilobytes, so 4096 bytes, not very much storage. And they're automatically sent with each request. On top of that, they can only be sent to the website which they came from, unless explicitly stated otherwise. And they're not necessarily accessible by JavaScript. That has advantages and disadvantages. And you can store the JOT as a cookie if you so desire. And what's the alternative to a cookie? Well, these can only store strings. Same with the local storage. What's the alternative? Well, it's Html5 storage. From Wikipedia, it says web storage can be viewed simplistically as just an improvement on cookies. It didn't have a citation, but somebody has that opinion. And so there's two different types of Html5 storage. There's local storage, which is persistent, and session storage, which deletes after the window is closed. These can store a large amount of data, 5 megabytes, even more. I think Internet Explorer allows you to store 10 megabytes, which is quite a lot, a few pictures, like a couple music files. And it's only accessible via JavaScript, and it's only accessible while it's running on the same domain. Meaning if you have multiple websites you visit that all use localhost or local storage, they're only accessible from that website. And again, these can only store strings as well. So we can do a quick demo on what local storage and session storage are. We can visit any page, like the bootcamp page, and bring up the console. And we have this thing called local storage. If you see It has length of 0 right now. We have nothing in it. It's an object. And we have session storage, which also has nothing in it right now. And so how do we start to use it? We can say, well, local storage, the item is test. And if we look at local storage again, it now has one thing, the test. Same thing with session storage. This also has one thing, which is test. What happens when we close the page and then reopen it? If we inspect local storage, that item is still there. If we inspect session storage, it is now gone. And so both of these have a very large capacity. Unfortunately, they're both susceptible to different types of hacks or attacks. One is called cross-site request forgery, or Csrf. And what this is it gets a user to visit a state-changing URL, so a URL that will change their password, or send money in this case, or something like that. And then since cookies are automatically included for every request, the request is automatically authenticated. And so it will just go through. And so there's generally some sort of social hacking that goes along with this. Like I'll send you a Facebook message, be like, check out this cool thing I made at this link. You visit the link and then I send $10,000 to myself, something like that. And so I'm taking advantage of the fact that cookies are automatically sent. Another way you can do this is through email. So I can say like something like, hey guys, like thank you for coming to class. Check out this new GitHub repo that I posted here, where here is a href that points to this. And so you'll say, oh, cool, new GitHub thing, click it, and then I send money to myself. Yeah?
So, where is all, like, how are you getting access to what we, like our bank or something? I don't know.
So,
is it like the
yeah.
passwords we stored on our computer, I guess?
Yeah, so question is, how am I getting access to your bank and stuff? And so cookies are automatically sent with every request to that domain. And so if you've already logged into that domain, you're still kind of logged in just by sending your cookie. And so if I get you to visit some sort of page on that website, specifically a state-changing one, because I won't be able to see your response, that state will happen. And in this case, at bank.com, the action is a transfer amount 10,000 and to where? To me. That would just execute since you're already authenticated. Other ways this will happen is if I send you an email with an image, with the href of some GET request that I want to make, you won't necessarily see that. I can make it a 0x0 image, but the GET request will still execute. Or I can send you a form that automatically submits to somewhere that does that with a post request. And so this is called Csrf, and it's an attack that takes advantage of cookies. What about a similar attack with session storage or local storage? Well, there's this thing called cross-site scripting, or XSS. And this is what this does is it injects bad JavaScript into some sort of site. And then every user who visits that site will then execute that JavaScript automatically, which may take advantage of their whatever they have in their local storage and maybe send requests on their behalf. Or maybe send me their token. Because as we know, we could do something like a route in Express where we have something, 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 question mark token equals something, or slash something, or we can use rec.params or rec.query in order to get at whatever we sent. And so I could say, I'm going to inject bad JavaScript into Facebook or into some forum that you visit, and then it will send me your token. So I could say, send a request to jordanhayashi.com / token equals this. And so I will then have your token, and I can make requests on your behalf. Yeah?
For Csrf,
Mm-hmm.
I understand you can send someone an email, and if they're already authenticated, then you can take advantage, but how would you go about using JavaScript?
About to talk about that. So how then do I take advantage of websites? How do I get my JavaScript to run on those websites? So say we're browsing some sort of forum, like forum.com, I don't know if that exists, and they don't sanitize their inputs. And so what they do is they just show a bunch of posts and comments that people have made. But what if instead of a comment, I actually write something like open script, fetch jordanhayashi.com, question mark token, plus localhost or localstorage.token, and then I send that request, and then close my script, and then have maybe like a P like, hello everybody. And so when that site sends that comment, it will actually be within script tags. And if they don't sanitize their input, that script will just run on every single person's computer who visits that site. So you can try this on Facebook, comment on somebody's thing like open script tag, fetch whatever, close script tag, and I'm pretty sure Facebook sanitized their input. I'm sure people have tried this before, but it will just show up as a string script rather than actual HTML that gets executed. Does that make sense? And so cross-site request forgery takes advantage of the fact that websites trust you, and this one takes advantage of the fact that you trust websites. And so if we have control over websites, we can prevent this from happening. Cross-site request forgery is a little bit harder to prevent. And so now that we know about these hacks, where should we store our token? Which one should we use, cookies or local storage? Let's take a vote. Who thinks cookies? Who thinks local storage? Okay, this is not awkward. We should use local storage. So Pug already sanitized our strings for us. So if we look at the documentation here, we can see Unescape Attributes. By default, all attributes are escaped, which means it replaces special characters with escape sequences. So if somebody says, writes a comment or something that says open script, close script, it will actually look like this, and less than script and greater than. And so it will just be rendered as a string rather than be rendered as actual HTML. And so this actually prevents attacks such as cross-site scripting, blah, 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 blah. And it cautions you again, always escape the code. If you tell it explicitly to be unescaped, you might be vulnerable to this thing called cross-site scripting. Cool, so now if we use Pug, we're not susceptible to any cross-site scripting attacks. We're not susceptible to Csrf. And so let's hop on it and use it. Any questions about cookies versus local storage? Yeah?
Is local storage specific to a web page you visit, or is it like in your browser for any web page you visit?
So it's stored within your browser, and it's specific to a certain domain. Meaning if I had set local storage item equals test on jordanhayashi.com, if I visit another page on my domain, it will have that in there. But if I now visit google.com and I inspect my local storage, then it's a whole bunch of stuff that Google's using. All right, so we are going to wire up our front end in order to be able to log in. So does everybody remember what happens when we log in? We send a request over to our backend to that /auth/token endpoint with our username and password, and then we get back a token. What should we do with that token? Well, we should store it in local storage and then redirect them to wherever they need to go. So if you pull from the Bootcamp repo, I pushed a lot of front-end code last night, and we're going to go ahead and finish the front end today. And so yesterday, we pretty much finished all of the back-end stuff. I pushed a solution code if you checked it out, and we'll be running that today as our back end. So if you clone that repo, you can go ahead and start up that server and that MongoDB instance. Ooh, actually, it would be better if you started your MongoDB instance from your older directory and then the server from this directory. That way you don't have to reset the mongod.conf stuff. So we have the same problem with that MongoD file if you pull from the solution code. So it might be better to start the MongoD instance from whatever code you had from previous days, which was all working. And so start this Mongo server in some terminal window with that. And then if you clone the solution, then you can go ahead and start the Express server through the solution.
Wait, what's the command to start Mongo?
So if you're within the bootcamp directory and you cd into the coupon API, then you could cd into models, and then MongoD -f that file. And then go ahead and start off the solution API Express server with node coupon API.js. Yeah. It will, but you'll have that same problem where the MongoD.conf will be my file rather than yours, which is why you have to run them separately. So if you go to your own, you have to find your own MongoD file, which should be in like the API folder /models, and then you run MongoD, which is the command to start the Mongo as a daemon, which means it runs in the background, and then -f MongoD.conf. And so -f means use this configuration file, and then you just give it the configuration file. Was everybody able to do that? Is anybody having any troubles? Yeah.
When I type that in, it just returns. The
Try running kill all MongoD first. Good. Anybody having any issues? Yeah.
There's no MongoD. There's no Mongo conf in my model folder.
In API or frontend? Have you been running it before? How are you running it before?
I cloned this last night. This is like the new repo.
Yeah, so find the MongoD folder in your old repo. So that's the one that you'll be running. Otherwise, you'll be running my own.
So we want to be running the old.
Yeah, so run the MongoD file that you wrote a few days ago. That way it'll run specifically for your computer, and then run my Express server. And they can talk to each other.
What's supposed to happen?
You get like a new line and nothing happens.
So for the old one, we want to do npm run dev, or
For the new one, just run nodes the server. Because npm run dev is a script that starts the MongoD server and also starts the Express server. But if you start the MongoD server manually, then you don't have to restart it again.
so in our old API, we want to start just the server.
Just the Mongo server, exactly.
So I do database in the old one, and then npm run dev in your solution.
Node coupon API. Because what npm run dev does is it starts the MongoD server and the other one. And so we're kind of splitting it up.
Do you need to npm install for the new one?
Yes. You will have to npm install some modules. Yeah.
And the reason that error happens is just because the file addresses are different in mongo.conf.
Exactly.
Okay, so if we just go in and change those and then do npm run dev, that'll still work as well.
Yes, but I didn't actually push a MongoD.conf with the solution.
Okay.
So you'll have to actually use the old one. Yeah.
When I'm running the front end, it keeps it no daemon keeps like saying app crash.
The front end?
It's something about auth is not defined.
What is not fine? Oh, I'll just run it. So if you just pulled front end and do npm install, Oh man, I did this thing again where I deleted a file. Hold on 1 second. All right, so if you're getting that auth is not defined, then within your routes, there's an Auth Js file, which if you look at it, it's pretty much exactly the same as we wrote yesterday, just ported over to the front end instead. And then within index, you just have to write const auth gets require auth at the top. Sorry about that. I took it out and then I put it back in, and then I took it out and forgot to put it back in. I can push it, but I don't want to risk any merge conflicts for one line of code. So if you are in the front end directory, cd routes, then within index.js, just add const auth gets require auth /auth because it's in the same directory.
And that's it.
Yep, and then go ahead and do npm run dev or however you want to do it. If you get the port 10,000 is already in use, it means there's an instance of grunt already running. So you can just run kill all grunt and then rerun it and it'll work. So is everybody able to get both servers running? Yeah, so the change I made on the front end was within routes, change index to include const. So const auth gets require auth /auth.
Right now we should have the MongoDB connection
Mm-hmm.
and then the coupon API.js running.
Yep.
And now we're going to do the coupon front end.
Exactly. So we have 3 things running. Well, 4 things running right now. We have MongoD running. We have the API running, so that makes up our backend. And now we have the front-end server running, the Express file running, and also Grunt running and watching any changes. So we now have 4 servers all running on our computer. So NodeMon is an extension. It's an NPM package that allows, it's like an auto restart if it sees any changes in the file.
You said before that wasn't working for you, but now
It never works for me. It's supposed to auto restart if it sees a change, but you can force it by doing rs, and it'll restart for you. If you're on Windows, you'll probably have to do what you've been doing. Yeah.
So we have to run Node coupon API separately?
Yeah, so you have one terminal window with MongoD running, one terminal window with the API running, and one terminal with the front end running. MongoD running is if you go to your old API folder, and then so if you go into your old API folder and cd into the models directory, you should have that mongod.conf file that you wrote a while back. And then you can just run mongod-f mongod. And I already have one running, so it's not going to run again. but you should just have the prompt on the next line just not doing anything.
Would it also work if we moved that mongo.conf folder into the models folder, or would it kind of like mess with that system?
It would work, but you would have to change. Right now, my package.json is looking for it in a different directory, so you'd have to update the npm run dev command. Is everybody ready to go? What's the issue?
Should we be using your solution?
I would recommend using my solution for the API because it's completely built out.
So we clone it inside the bootcamp directory.
You can clone it wherever you want. You just have to make sure to npm install first to get all the modules, and then run the server file somewhere.
So in the front end, I can just go npm run dev.
After you npm install, yeah. You'll also have to add the const auth equals require auth, but yeah.
Actually, where is auth located?
Within the same folder. So if you cd into the bootcamp folder, cd into coupon frontend, within routes, we have auth.js and index.js. And index is where all the routes are stored, and auth is just pretty much a copy of that auth file that we wrote yesterday. So you just need to write const auth gets require auth. All right, Raj, can you talk Jeffrey through what we... Yeah.
My backend's like throwing us off.
404? Meaning when you try to visit routes?
Just like the index.
So there's no index on the API. You can't visit / on the API.
Yeah, even routes.
What do you mean? Routes is not a route on the backend. So if you visit something like /users, you should just get a, okay.
So
Yeah.
I don't really understand why we can't do npm run dev if we put the conf file in the new.
Because if you look at the package.json within the new one, this is Frontend. If you look at my npm run dev, it's actually looking for the Mongo file over here, which does not exist on your computer.
Because like when I ran it,
It did? Oh, if you ran it and it worked, it means you have a Mongo file here. Or you have another Mongo instance that happens to be running, which is more likely the case. If it worked, don't worry about it. Yeah.
Is it possible to put like an npm run all where that script runs like all the 3 things that we need all in one?
Yes and no. So you would have to have a package.json that's outside of the other ones. Or you would have to just hard code the directories. What I have is a bash script that does exactly that. So if I run dev just on my computer, it will start up all of my stuff. But
can you say again what we need to have running?
all right, so what you need to have running right now is MongoD somewhere. You need to have the backend server running. You need to have the front-end server running. And then optionally, you have Grunt running as well.
Does npm run dev run the front end or not?
Yeah, on the front end, if you run npm run dev, it starts the front-end server and Grunt. And if you run npm run dev on the back end, it won't work for you. But you could configure it to start MongoD and the back-end server. Was everybody able to do this? Yeah.
So for the backend server, instead of running npm run dev, we haven't set that up. The command is
So find your mongod.conf file, which is in your old API.
Mongo, but I need to run the
Just node couponapi.js. Yeah. Anybody have any issues, or can I press ahead? All right, 2 minutes. Yeah.
File.
And now we jump to.
There's a lot of files. I can talk through the file directory in a second.
So the Mongo things could be where the Mongo file is.
If you are going to change your package.json to make the npm run dev work, you would have to change this directory to point to wherever your mongod.conf file is.
Is it indicating that it's in? Is it indicating that it's in a new?
This is indicating that I have it on my computer outside of the actual project file, because I have a lot of different MongoDB things, so
Would it be
a lot of different
bad
projects.
to like duplicate the comp file and then put it in your solution?
You would also have to update this path.
Oh, okay.
So you could do that, and you'd have to just change this to be something like it would have to be like models like this, and then it would work if you duplicated it over. But I think that's unnecessarily complicated. So as long as you have it working, then don't worry about anything I say until we start coding. Yeah.
This isn't directly related to the matters at hand, but if we were to create a website
Mhm.
and we wanted our servers to always be running even when we're not on our computer,
Mhm.
we haven't set this up. How do we make that happen?
So question is, if you write your own website and you want the servers to just never die, there are a couple different things. There's this thing called Forever, which is a command line tool that ensures that a given script runs continuously. Or there's this thing that I prefer called PM2. Which does pretty much the same exact thing.
But for example, what if you turn your computer off, but you want your website to still be accessible by people?
Okay, so what if I turn my computer off and I want it to still be accessible? You would have to run it not on your computer, but on some computer out in the cloud somewhere, which could be AWS, it could be...
So you need money.
You don't necessarily need money. AWS has a free tier, which will work for a year. So jordanhayashi.com is hosted on AWS. I haven't paid a penny for however long it's been up. I just create a new email and create a new server, and then 1 year later it's still up. You can use Heroku, which is a free one. So the thing about AWS is it's extremely complicated to set up. I wanted to teach it during class, but I didn't get the okay because it was too complicated. But not Docker, Heroku, which we'll talk about tomorrow. We'll talk about exactly this problem tomorrow. But just looking ahead, Heroku allows you to do just that. So it's a remote server, and you can build apps rather than infrastructure, and then you just deploy, and it manages and scales automatically. It also has a free tier. The downside to it is it has to sleep like 6 hours a day, so you can't have it running continuously, which means if you visit it and it had fallen asleep, it'll take a few seconds to boot up and start. But it is also free. It runs Node automatically, and you can just run it with a git push command. Oh, does anybody recognize what files this is, what they're working on right now? It's their own package.json. Yeah, exactly. And so you see a script. You see a bunch of other stuff, some dependencies. Yeah.
So what's like Heroku's business model? Like, do they just offer? I'm just curious, like, why they would do that.
Yeah. So question: how is Heroku still in business? Answer: so that you have to pay in order to have something running continuously, and if you want like to host a big website on there, you have to pay big bucks.
Okay, so it's like a subscription service. Still,
Kind of,
they
yeah.
still have like a paid for version.
Yeah, for sure. So you can have a free one, which sleeps after 30 minutes, or you can have like these performance ones, which are like 25 to 500 bucks per dyno per month. And if you're like Facebook, you'll have thousands of dynos running. So a dyno's in a script, I guess, would be the simplest way to put it. All right, so we'll get into all of this tomorrow. Has everybody got the servers running already? So, if your servers are all running, then you will be able to visit localhost/3001 and see our index page, which we wrote. I added a bit to the validation, so now it automatically will validate. But we're going to skip that page for now and work on our login page. So is everybody able to get to this login page? So if you notice, the submit button doesn't do anything, and so we're going to wire it up so that it works. All right, so if we're going to make this submit button do something using JavaScript, which file are we going to have to use? So index.js and routes is one guess, and what that file does, so let me just talk you through the files in the front end first. Can everybody read that, or is it too small? Well, you can just view it on your own computer. Anyway, so we have a few things in our root directory, which include coupon frontend.js. What does that do? Anyone? That's the server file. That's what gets our server running. What does the grunt file do? Yeah, it configures our task runner. What does package.json do? Everybody should know that one. I'm not even going to go over it. And then we have three folders. We have public, routes, and app. So routes is one thing that we don't have in our backend. What it is it's actually all of our controllers. So our controllers on our backend, since they have a lot of logic, we split them up. But on our front end, there's not really any logic to any of our routes. It just serves up a page, or it forwards the request to the backend. And so we can jam it all in one file called index.js within our routes. And so these are all of our routes. You can see if you get slash, all it does is render the index page. If you post to slash, all it does is forward that request to the backend /users, and then just pipes the result back. And .pipe just means whatever result you have, just pass it over to our response. So that's just classic, what kind of proxy? Reverse proxy, right? So we act like we're the backend, but we're actually just sending it to the backend and piping the response over. If you get the login page, it just renders the login page. If you post to the login, what do? We act like a reverse proxy. We send that request over to post users. That's not right. It should be, what should we actually post to for our login? Can somebody fix my bug? So post login, what it does is it sends the login. And so what endpoint should we do? We shouldn't actually post users, because that would create a user. That's not what we want to do.
Auth-token.
Yeah, exactly. Auth/token. I put that in intentionally so that you guys could find that. So, good? And so if we get the admin page, we first check if the user's actually an admin. How do we have access to rec.user? Why do we have access to rec.user? It's not part of Express's API. So where did that come from? So within router.get/admin, we have this rec.user thing, which is not part of the API. We can't say Express, what is this rec.user, because it doesn't exist. Which means we created it somewhere. Yeah, Tiff? Yeah, so we set it in this first middleware that it goes through. So auth.admin required is exactly the same function that we wrote yesterday. And if you remember, we decode that token and then pass the decoded token to rec.user, which is now accessible by all of the other middleware in the chain. And so what we do is we check to make sure they're an admin. If they are an admin, then we redirect them to this page, admin/coupons, question token equals rec.token. What the heck is that? Anyone know?
So it takes them to a page that is specific to their token?
Yeah, so it takes them to a page /admin/coupons, which is right here, which requires an admin, which means they require a token in order to visit it. And so how do we pass the token? Well, we can do it in the rec.body, which we can't since it's a GET request. We can put it in the headers, which is tough if it's a GET request and it's not like a AJAX request. So our only other option is to stick it in the URL, and so that's what we did here. $token equals their token. So we redirect them to this page, which renders the coupon page, which allows them to see any of the coupons. Yeah?
Sorry, can you just explain where, so like rec.user and rec.token,
Mhm.
where are those properties?
Yeah. So if you look into Express, you're like, oh, I see rec.something. What is it? And if you look into the Express documentation, it's not in there. And so it's something we created within our auth file. And so if you remember that validate token function that we wrote yesterday, what we do is you grab the token, so it can be in the rec.body, it can be in the query, or it can be in the headers, query being the URL parameter. If there's no token, we redirect them to logout. We say, hey, no. We try to decode their token. If it works, then they're good. If not, then we redirect them to logout again. And then we do this admin required, whatever. And then we do this thing, rec.user equals decoded. And so we're attaching a new object, which is going to be a property of that request object. And so decoded is an object which is now rec.user, which is now accessible by all of the latter middleware in our chain. And rec.token gets their original token. And so we're now passing it through to the other middleware. Does this construct make sense? Yeah? And so, yeah.
So because it's middleware and it's saying next,
Mhm.
everything within that block or that like that function is then passed on and is accessible.
So because we're calling next, it invokes the next middleware in the chain. And so what happens to all of these local variables? Well, if you remember with JavaScript, the variable scope, their lifetime is when they're created. So wherever they're called here, so var token gets created there until the end of their function. So var token goes away when this function finishes. So how do we actually pass it? Well, if you remember what middleware does is they have access to the request object, the response object, and the next middleware in the chain. And so we can actually pass it through that request object. And so we're saying, all right, let's tack this on as part of the request object. So rec.user is going to keep track of decoded because that will expire at the end of this. And same thing with the token. So this is how we start to pass variables from one middleware to the other. Make sense? So if we did not know that we could do that, what other ways can we have variables accessible by other functions? The only way would be to have them be in a higher scope. And so what would happen if rather than doing rec.user gets decoded, rec.token gets token, we actually had a global variable called rec.user or user, and a global variable called token. So those variables would be accessible by all of the other children, all the other functions. What would be the issue with that?
It's public.
It's not public, so nobody can access the variables on our server. And this would absolutely work if we only had one user.
There would only be one user able to use the request will see the same user no matter how many other people are using it.
Yeah, so JavaScript is so asynchronous. What happens if we run this validate token, then somebody else comes in with a new token, and we set this to be the user, that user gets overwritten by the next person, but then the next middleware in the chain gets invoked on the wrong person. And so just because there's so many requests that we expect to come in, and Node is so asynchronous, we can't guarantee that if we set a global variable, when we invoke our next function, the global variable will not have changed. And so this is the way to do it. Make sense? Yeah.
You're doing this authorization in both the
Yeah, and we'll address that in the next lecture. And so question is, we're doing this authorization, both the front end and the back end. And so, yes, that's very inefficient. We should not do that. But for what we're going to do right now, this is the more efficient way to do that. And we'll look at next lecture a even more efficient way to do that. All right, so that is everything in routes. It's just pretty much our controllers. We stuck auth in there just because it was a controller. We didn't know where else to put it. Then we have this folder called public, which is here. What's in public? Well, we have our fonts, which is Roboto, because I'm choosing to use Roboto as our font. We have images, which right now is just a loading image. Loading good.gif. We have our JavaScript. Fetch.js, which does what? Does anybody remember? What does that fetch.js file do? What's that special name I gave to it? It's a polyfill. It allows us, it builds out that fetch function if the browser hasn't already natively implemented it. So that's called a polyfill. And we have script.min.js, which is what? The minified script that we wrote, minified by Grunt. Then we have our style sheets, which is our CSS, which was created by Grunt. And so that's everything in public. What's special about the public directory? Yeah, Barty?
Something like the rest of the world.
Yeah, everybody can access that public directory. Why or how or what line of code allowed us to do that? Express static, which is middleware, which says, hey, open up this directory to the rest of the world. And so we called it the public. So up here, where we have app.use, express static, path join, dir name, public, yeah.
Okay, what's the purpose of making it public? Like all the fonts and like images?
So images, so what's the point of making the stuff public? And so that's stuff that never changes. There's no logic that needs to be applied to that stuff. It's all just what's called static assets. And so why would we go through the trouble to create a route called /style style sheets /style.css and say just res.render, res.send this file. And every image that we add, we would have to define a route for that and say, all right, serve this static image. And so for this static stuff, that doesn't really make sense. We can just say, hey, why don't you just automatically look in that directory and just serve that, because we don't have any logic that's applied to that. And so that's what express.static does. It says, use this directory as a directory to serve static assets. So anything in that, just send it right over. You don't need to run it through our routes or our controller or anything. What would be the dangers if we did this? Yeah, so now we just said express.static our entire site. So somebody could just go visit our site, localhost 3000 / couponfrontend.js, and it would just serve up this file. And if they visited our route /index, it would serve up that file, and so they would have access to all of our backend code. If they visit /model /config.js, our app would just serve up our config file. Yeah.
What do you mean by serve up that file?
It would just send it. So if we run this, so it is running, and say we look into our public file, and we want to get something in here. So say we wanted to grab fetch.js. That is within a directory called JS, called fetch.js. And so we can say, visit our page, this is our root, /js /fetch.js, and it would serve up that file. Just send it to us. And same thing with our script.min.js. And same thing with any of the assets in here. So if we wanted to grab roboto italic.ttf, we could do /fonts that, and it would download that file. And so if we had exposed our entire directory, people could just get our conf file. Do you want to see an example of that, or can you envision? Yes, example, or yes, envision? We can envision. Cool. And so that's everything in our public. And then lastly, we have our app file, which is all of our just logic and all of our everything. And so we have /js, which is our JavaScript, which we will include into our page to run. We have our models, which is our config file. We have our style sheets, which is helpers.style. Did anybody even look at that? All it is some stuff where if you write border radius, it'll actually include these other things that are border radius in other browsers. So opacity, Moz opacities like Firefox opacity. Background size, it'll add all this stuff. If you want to use Flexbox, if you noticed on our Flexbox website, you actually have to put display flex, but also all of this stuff. And so this will do it automatically for you. And so this is just a helper file that I wrote, so I don't need to remember all of the other syntax stuff. Yeah.
So how do you use it if you just say flexbox? Will it include all of them?
Yeah, so for this, if you give it border radius, then a couple numbers or a number, it will automatically stick all of these in there for you. For Flexbox, you just say Flexbox open close like a function, and it will include all of that for you. Yeah.
So those numbers are arguments?
Yeah. So arguments are arguments. So if you say opacity 50%, then the 50% argument would get passed to all these. And this, even though it looks exactly the same, it's different. You just say Flexbox, pass it no arguments, and it'll insert all of that in. Yeah.
Can you define Flexbox both in helpers and in style? And will those conflict, or can you
So if you look within this, at the very top, we have require helpers. And so stylus files can actually require each other as well. And so if you read through the stylus documentation, you'll see all of the powerful things that stylus can do. And so these two things at the top are variables. And so it's easy to change later.
Wait, so if I wanted to make a flexbox, am I doing .flexbox?
So if we wanted to make HTML and body flexbox, you could just do flexbox. But just read the documentation and it'll talk you through these things. Because after next week, it'll be lonely. You won't have me talking at you. You'll have to just Google around. Or you can email me and I'll happily respond with read the documentation. 2 weeks from now, sorry. Later in life. So you have one more week to use me as a resource and the other TFs.
Jordan,
Yeah.
can you repeat? Sorry, we've gone over this a bunch, but where fetch is happening, fetch requests that you have the polyfill for?
Yeah, so if we check out this fetch.js, what it does is we see this open parentheses function self. So if you see open parentheses before a function, what kind of function is that? Is an iffy, yeah. So if we go to the bottom of the file, we'll see it immediately get invoked by itself. And so what this does is it adds that polyfill function, fetch function. Because if you look in the browser, so say we're looking in Chrome, and you type fetch, it says function fetch. It's a function. I don't have Internet Explorer on here, but if I had an early version of Internet Explorer and I type fetch, it would say undefined or that does not exist. And so what this does is it's a function that defines fetch. And so if fetch wasn't already implemented, if it already was implemented, it wouldn't run. But if it were not implemented, then this would run and define that function, which we then could use anywhere we want. And so how do we get it to run on every single page? Well, within our template, which everything gets loaded from, at the very top we have script source gets /js /fetch.js, which if you remember was that path that I went to in order to grab that file. And so it'll just run that script before it even starts invoking the body. And then here where we have block content, that's all of the content that we add. Then we have our script. And then I have this thing where it says script local storage.token equals token. Don't worry about that for now. But then we have block postscript. So I said, what if we wanted to run some stuff after the script? So I created another block for that. And then there's this if dev, the live reload stuff. Yeah.
What is the difference between fetch and request?
So request, so what's the difference between fetch and request? So request is an NPM package, which can only be run within a Node.js application. So this can only run on the back end. Whereas fetch is actually a web API, which means it can only be run from within the browser. And so they're very, very analogous, but one is on the back end and one is on the front end. Yeah?
Can you explain again where we're using the request and the fetch?
Yeah, so where are we using request and fetch? So request, we have to use on the backend because it's a backend specific package. And so we use it within our routes in order to make requests. And so within our routes, if you remember, we are creating a reverse proxy, which means any requests that come into ours, we act like we're the actual responder, but we're not. Our API backend is actually the responder, so we need to send that request over. And so in order to send a request, we have to use that request package, which is here. And so if you see at the top, we have, oh, it's included in the other one. We should put it in here too, though.
Where is it included?
I think it's included in, where is it included? How is it working? It should have complained at us, but it didn't. So add that at the top. So we had to include the request package, and then we go ahead and use it down here. But yeah, so on the back end, we use that request to forward that information or forward that request over to our backend server. And then on the front end, we can't use request anymore because it's a backend specific package.
Like back end of the front end.
What?
Like back end of the front end.
Yeah, so this is like the back end of the front end.
Yeah, sorry, okay.
So this is the web server that serves our front end pages, whereas the back end server is what runs our API and sends our raw data. And so it's a little bit confusing because our front end also has a server to serve its pages. And so it's kind of like the back end of the front end. So excuse me if I use the terms ambiguously. But this is like our back end of our front end, which serves up pages. So you see res.render, but it also forwards requests to our back end. Our back end. Yeah. So fetch is within pages on our front end, and so we'll look at that in just a second. Yeah.
And this is the reverse proxy because, is that how you would like call it? So this is the reverse proxy because what's happening is everything, like when people use their site, things go to this server, but it's actually supposed to transfer to the second server, to the backend server.
Exactly. So this is a reverse proxy because no clients directly touch our API. Every API request is actually made through us, and so they don't even know if our API exists. So what we do is we take any request, so say something like a post to slash, which is a creation of a user, and we actually say, oh, that should be post/users. So we forward that request over to /users, and then pipe the response back. And so it's as if the response came from us. Yeah?
Is that a security thing? Like, to do the reverse proxy?
Yeah, so it's a security thing in that people don't actually know where our backend is, and it's also kind of a necessary thing because of CORS. Of course, we could have just changed our backend and added the access control origin policy thing, and then you could have made requests straight to our backend, but we chose to do this just so I could show what a reverse proxy was.
Which one's like more typical of industry?
Which one's more typical of industry? It's really hard to know because you don't know if you're hitting a reverse proxy. That's the whole point of it. But I would say this is more common just because things like Nginx are used. So you have to use a reverse proxy if you want to do load balancing, stuff like that. So yeah.
So for the fetch code, you just copy that?
Yeah, fetch code I literally just copied from here. So this is their polyfill, and I just downloaded it, threw it up in our repo, and served it.
So you download the whole...
So I just downloaded the actual file itself. So fetch.js. And so our views and style sheets, we all understand, right? We're all good with views and style sheets. And so we have here our JavaScript file, which has front-end code on it. So how does this run on our front end? What gets this to run on our front end? Anybody? Exactly. So what happens with our script is we write it here, then we run grunt and it gets minified and put into our public directory, public/js/script.min.js. And then within our views, every single view, because it's in the template, we have script. The source is that minified script, so it just runs when every page gets viewed. So is everybody, yeah?
So there are variables in the script.js,
Mhm.
like months, for instance. Are these accessible on, if we open up like Chrome DevTools and try to see it?
Yep. So is everybody clear on how we organize all of our files? Everybody know what every file does? We're okay to start forging ahead with new stuff? If there are any uncertainties at all, I'm happy to clear them up. No? All right, so let's get our page implemented. So right now we have our login page. Right now the submit button doesn't do anything. And so how do we get it to do something? Well, let me see if I can do this cool split screen thing. All right. And look at that, mobile friendly. So let's first check out the view itself. So it'll be the login. And so we have this navbar thing, which is this stuff. We have our form, hash JS login form.form. And so that's this, the form. We have our h1 form title gets login. We have JS error message.error message, which is an error message that might show. We have one input, which is an email. The name is email. Placeholder email. On focus is clear error, which is that stuff that we wrote. We have the same thing with password. And then we have a button, whereas on click is submit login. So let's go ahead and check out the script. And so you see I have a lot of code written. And down here, we have a to-do, which is the submit login. Right now it does nothing. And so how can we confirm that it's actually running? Well, we can console.log something. Or alert. So that runs. Oh. during my demo, I wiped out all of my node modules.
What is metadata?
So what is metadata? Did somebody want to answer? No. So metadata is just some invisible information that's connected with every file. And so like with the image file, there's metadata that tells the computer what the height is and what the width is and how big the file is and what color space to use and stuff like that. And so what information is actually in the metadata depends on what kind of file it is, but every file has metadata. Because like a BMP, a bitmap image, is just a string of pixels, a string of colors. And so the metadata says, all right, this is the width of it, so it knows when to wrap around. And this is the height of it, so you know what to do. All right, so now that it works, if we hit submit, then it alerts us to click. So now let's actually write the submit login page so that it does something. So first we need to have a form. And so at the top, we already have our form gets document.forms bracket 0. And so document.forms is an array of all the forms on the page. And bracket 0 means just grab the first form. And so we just have to make sure that the form we want to use is the first form on the page. And so now we have access to forms, so we can say, we can have our normal validation. So if there's no form.email, then what should we do? Well, we have that error function that we wrote last time, so we can just pass it to the error form.email. And same thing with the form password. So if there's no password, and so last time we went through the iteration where first we returned, and then we said, hey, no, we want all of the messages to show. So then we had something like var bad form equals false. And then we would make this true if it was a bad form. And then we did this thing called a display error, like a message. And we said var error message got empty string. And if one of these were true, we would add that to the message. So we would do something like error message. And then we add something like missing. We're going to have a missing email. And same thing here. So error message plus equals missing password. And I'm saying if they're already missing if there's already an error message, add a new line in between. And so now we have this thing where we're passing an error message, and if the error message exists, then we should display it and exit. So if error message, then we can return that display error thing, display error, that error message. Right, so let's test that. Oops, better save. It compiles, and then, oh, missing email and missing password. Oh, now we're only missing the password. So does everybody remember that form validation we did? And so now comes the meat of it. Now we're going to actually add some data and use fetch to send that data. So if we're now at this point in our code, we know that the password value and the email value both exist. And so what can we go ahead and do? What should be my next line? So what's our goal? What are we trying to do here?
The user exists and the password matches with that user, then you send them to whatever page they want.
Yeah, so we're trying to log them in, which requires a send to our backend or a reverse proxy. And so we're going to post this request. And so we need to build that form. We need to build the JSON that we're going to send. And so you can go ahead and do that with like var data gets an object, and in it is going to be the email. And also the password. All right, so now we've validated all of their information. We've created an object which holds that data. And so now we can use our fetch implementation in order to send that request over. So let's open up our routes to see where we should actually send this request. And so we're having the login page be at post/login. So we're just going to send a post request to /login. How do we do that? Well, with fetch. So we can do fetch. What's the URL? /login. And then we can pass it a config where the method is going to be post. Then what's its body going to be? Well, it's going to be the data. But in what form? Well, it has to be stringified JSON. And so we need to go ahead and do this json.stringify call, which creates that into the body. And one thing we're missing is we have to explicitly tell the request, hey, expect the content, the type of this content to be JSON. And so that's within the header. So we do this content type gets application /JSON. And so that's our fetch call. So fetch is very simple, but remember it returns a promise, so we need to remember to take care of the .then. So what should we do? Let's do .then, which takes a function with the result. And first we need to check if it was okay. So if it wasn't okay, then we'll just alert, uh-oh. Otherwise, we can go ahead and extract the JSON from the body. And how do we do that? Well, it's that res.json call. And if you remember, res.json is actually a promise. So we can go ahead and do a .then on that, which itself takes another function with the result. I can't call it res because I already have something called res, so I'll call it result. And what should we do with that result? Well, remember what the result is. It's an object where its token gets token. And so let's go ahead and just alert the tokens. So alert your token is plus the result, the token. And then we also have a catch. And we'll just do a function which will console.log the error. Does that make sense what we did? So does somebody want to volunteer to talk me through my code? If there are no volunteers, I'll make a volunteer.
All the way from the start of.
All the way from, yeah, all the way through the whole function. Or one person to talk through up to fetch, and then one person to talk through fetch. Anybody want to volunteer for the first half? Gerardo?
You declare error message as an empty string.
Mm-hmm. And so what benefit is having it an empty string?
In case there are no errors.
Yeah, so if there's no errors, it's a falsy value. Yeah.
And so if no email is entered, you call the error function on that email, and then you add this email to the error message. Same with the password. And then you also check there's already an error message that we got in line. And then if there's an error message, you display the error message.
Exactly. All right, who wants to talk through that fetch call? All right, Chiang?
So when you have to do the entire thing, or
Just the fetch call.
I mean, it's saying take you to the login endpoint, and so the header means like when you parse it, like what's inside is JSON,
Mm-hmm.
and it's basically saying use the post method,
Mm-hmm.
and just pass in the JSON, like JSONify version of the data.
Yep. And then the thens. So what? Keep going.
Oh, you want me to keep going?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. And then if that fetch doesn't work, then you get an alert.
Mm-hmm.
Because like that, you get a response from the fetch.
All right, so I'll have a little clarification here. So the then clause happens if there's any response at all. So even if it's a 400 or something like that. So the catch will only happen if there's an actual error with the fetch itself, not if there is an error code returned with the call. And so even if the result is a 500, the fetch still worked. It did what it wanted to do. And so that's what that res.ok is. It's saying, hey, the fetch worked, but the status code was something that was not 200 or 204, something like that. But yeah.
And then, or else, basically just tell the user what their token was.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. So let's try to run this. So HSA coupons is something that's in my database. And if I submit, hey, we got a token back. Yeah.
What is the res.ok?
Yeah, so res.ok is part of fetch. So they built that in. Yeah, so the reason that fetch either calls the then or it calls the catch, and it only calls the catch if fetch itself failed, meaning if the request could not go through. And so no matter what, if the request goes through, it'll call the then clause. And so sometimes our backend might reject the request, like maybe it was bad input, like a 400, or maybe that endpoint didn't exist, a 404, or maybe we had an internal server error. And so fetch was like, that's not my problem. I worked exactly as you wanted me to do, so I'm not going to invoke my catch. but we need to have some way to validate, hey, was the status code something that was okay? Did the response itself go through as planned? And so that's what the response.ok is. And it's true if, they don't specify, but it's true if it returns a 200 or like a 204 or 304 or something like that. So that's just something I picked up reading the documentation. So everybody understand what we wrote? And so now let's kind of build out our logic a little more. Yeah.
So how does it know there's like a token part of the result?
So it doesn't know, but we, since we wrote the backend, know that the response of that /auth/token is res.json, where the token is a token. And so if you want me to bring up the code, within our backend, for that login user endpoint, we know we go through all this stuff, get a token, and at the end we have this thing which is res.json, the token, and so this is just shorthand for token gets token. And so we know that it's going to return an object, a JSON, a stringified object, with a single attribute, something called token, and the value of that is their actual token. And so within our front end now, we know how that's going to work, and we can say, hey, this response is going to be a JSON, which is why we can do res.json, which means extract the JavaScript object from that JSON, from the body. And then we can pass that as a result and say, hey, we know that what the object looks like. It'll have one property called token, and that will be the token. So that's how we know we can just do result.token. And so if you're using that with the external API rather than one that you write, you have to just scour the documentation, say, hey, what exactly are they going to return? And so what methods and what properties will I be able to access of that object? Does that make sense? Great, so now let's build out the logic. Did you guys have a question?
No, it's just not working.
Oh, okay. I'll address the question first. Yeah.
So when we send it to the login route, like where is it?
So right now we're sending it to /login. /login means on our own server, and so that is actually a reverse proxy. And so what does the post/login do? Well, it reverse proxies, so it sends a post request to our API URL /auth/token. So it'll eventually hit this endpoint over here. And then pipe res means whatever they respond with, just send that as our response. Yeah. Coupons woo. It's in the config file.
Sorry, do we modify the login.pub file in the logo for the PostScript block?
So that was the code that I pushed.
I know, like, did we change it at all though? Like, you being an error since unexpected.
I don't think that we use it. Make sure that you have a user with that password. So I'll just the PostScript. So what the PostScript thing is, I wrote this script called submit on enter key. And what that does, if we have a pure JavaScript form, that's not actually a form, it won't submit on enter key. So I wrote a function that will listen for the enter key and make sure if you're within an input and you press enter key, then submit the form. And so that's what that PostScript thing is. You can delete that, you can delete all of it, and it's just the forms won't submit with enter. You'll have to press the button. Yeah, so since our button isn't actually like a submit button, it's just a HTML button that we add some style to, all it does is it's listening for an on click. And so the submit on enter key is the function that I wrote, which listens for the enter key press. And if the enter key is pressed, then it will run submit login, which is the same function that runs to submit our form. So I was too lazy to press the button, so I wrote a lot of code to save me one key press. Was everybody able to get this running prerequisites to have this work would be you need to have something in your database, some person in your database with a username and password.
But doesn't the init automatically add them?
The init should automatically add whatever you have in your config file.
But we have it so that the init file automatically runs.
Yeah, we should. So what errors are you guys getting? Is it alerting an error? So uh-oh. So if you inspect, so if you open up the console and look at your network. So here's a tool for debugging. If you open up your console and look at the network tab, you'll be able to see every single request you made, and you'll be able to see its status code and what it returned. And so make sure that the email and password that you send are something that's already in your database. And if so, you should get a 200. If not, you might get a 400 or something like that. And you can see what was responded by looking at the response. Yeah.
When you try to like register from the website, what does it mean if it says like there was a bounce and then
500 error means there's a problem with the backend, the API part. I'll look into that in a little bit. But does everybody understand the concept and the logic that we went through? All right, I'm going to forge ahead a little bit with logic so that you understand the concept so that you can then apply it to your debugging. All right, so bear with me. So now we're going to, rather than alerting what a token is, we're going to actually use that token. And so how do we do that? Well, we're going to store it into local storage. And so we can just go ahead and say, well, local storage dot token, or whatever you want to call it, equals that result dot token. And so now our token is saved in our local storage, which means it'll be there whenever we want to use it until we delete it. And now what do we want to do? Well, we should probably get them into that admin page that we wrote. So if you remember that /admin page, we can just redirect them to that. So we could say window.location. And I only know this because I Googled how to redirect JavaScript. And it said, oh, use window.location. So we can manually set that location to wherever we want. So let's do /admin. And so what is our problem with this? Can anybody spot it? Yeah, Barty. We do have a view, so I set it up. And so if I try to log in, forbidden redirecting to log out. Yeah.
Make sure the token, check the token, it's the right token for the user.
On the right track. So we actually need to send the token because we stored the token, but when we redirect to admin, we're not sending the token anywhere, right? We didn't put it in our body. It's not in our header. And so we have to actually put it in the URL. And so we need to say, hey, by the way, when you go to admin, make sure to do $token gets your token. And so now we're going to redirect to the admin page, which we wrote, and we're going to include the token. So if we log in, now we're in. And if we look at our URL, it has our token embedded in the URL. And so when we check in our routes to make sure it's a valid token, it can extract that. Does that make sense? Does it logically make sense?
So now the downside is that this token is saved in the browser history, right?
Yeah, so the downside of this is that token is saved in our browser history. And so next session, we'll look into how do we go about fixing that. Are people good with logic thus far? Do you want to practice, or do you want me to write an example error callback? Would anybody be interested in seeing how I handled errors, or would you rather practice? Yeah. Errors. All right, let's check out the error handler. So I wrote an error handler called submit error down here. And if you look at the code, it's saying check the status. So we're passing it a response and an optional message. And what it says is, so this should all be in your code already. So we check the status first. If it's within the 400 to 500 range, excluding 500, it means we either sent bad request or not found or something like that, unauthorized. And if you remember when we coded our backend, when we did res.status 400.send, we usually gave a descriptive error message. And so that actually gets sent. And so if our error was, or if our status was within that range, what we can do is return res.text. What does res.text do? Does anybody remember? It's very similar to res.json, because res.json extracts the JSON from a response, and res.text just extracts the text from a response. So this says go ahead and extract that text, and then with that message, do display error message. Does that make sense? We could have also just passed, we could have done .then display error, but I think this is a better way to be able to read it and see what it does. So if the status is not within that, and there we pass a message, then go ahead and just display that message. Otherwise, just say, hey, something went wrong. It wasn't within this range. I don't know what it was, so I'm just going to display a generic error message. Yeah?
So what was the point of having a separate situation for between
This?
400 and 500 rather than just displaying the message regardless?
Because with 500, it's generally just a blank response. And so we would want to send some sort of message.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So everybody can understand that code? And so now let's plug it in. So here's the function, and let's go ahead and add it to our submit login. So where would this go? So it should go in the then function somewhere. And so we can do, if not res okay, what should we do there? So if it's not res okay, it means it's probably within this range. So we can just go ahead and rather than alerting uh-oh, we can just pass it on to our error handler. Right? Does that make sense? So you can do return, submit, error, the result. Because submit error will check the status of the result, and it will actually extract the text for us. Make sense? And same thing with catch. We can just pass that straight over to submit error as well. So I'm getting an error.
Oh, you misspelled submit.
Oh. Heh. Still getting an error.
Oh, your local storage .token, window.token, or window location is like one space to the
Where?
Those lines, those 2 lines are like 1 space off.
They seem okay.
Do you need to pass in an argument for submit error on cat?
1 second. Line 25. Oh, what the? Where did this come from? All right. And so if we just pass a function to catch, it'll invoke that function and pass to it any of the arguments. So does that make sense? Let's go ahead and test that. Oops. So let's now pass it a bogus email. No user with that email. Why? Because if you remember when we coded the API, when we returned 400, we'd say, hey, there's no user with that email if we couldn't find the email in our database. And so now we can try with the real email, pass it a bad password, and it says incorrect password because that's the error message that we responded with from our API. Does that make sense? We could also really screw it up by killing our backend server. And so now when we send a response, it'll say there's a problem submitting your form. Please try again later. Why? Because at 500, or it just didn't respond because the server was down. And so it covers all of our cases. Does the logic make sense to everybody? So go ahead and, do you want to re-roll or do you want to be with partners from yesterday? Go ahead and in your project groups, did everybody get my email with your project groups? Go ahead and meet up with those project groups and then start working on what we learned today on your front-end stuff. So adding fetch to your forms. Good? All right.